Welcome to Best of the Nest, a weekly program produced by the television production students of Armstrong High School. Each and every week, we will take a look at some of the unique things happening in our school and communities. Today, we're talking about daylight savings time. I'm Stephen Wright of AHS-TV, and I'm joined by Mr. Zablocki and Mr. Landstrom. Would you two please tell us a little bit about yourselves for our viewers?
My name is David Zablocki. I'm a guidance counselor here at the high school. Been an employee at the district for 21 years. I'm just happy to be invited here on the program.
All right, thank you.
My name is Kevan Landstrom. I teach senior high life skills. This is my 12th year for teaching at Armstrong. And same thing, I'm just happy you guys invited me on.
Thank you guys very much. We're now going to take a closer look at the issues, or lack thereof, regarding daylight savings time.
Thanks, Stephen. I'm out in the halls of AHS to ask people their opinions on daylight savings time. I'm here with
Mr. Vineski.
and Mr. Vineski. Do you support the idea of daylight savings time?
No.
It's just been a part of my daily life ever since I was little, so I haven't really given it much thought about if I support it or not. But if I had to say yes or no, I would say yes.
It doesn't really affect me. It doesn't not bother me.
I don't really mind it, at all. It really doesn't bother me.
Now, daylight saving time is a very controversial topic. A lot of people aren't going to like my opinion, but I think we should do away with it.
Have you noticed it affects your sleep schedule then?
Well, I've noticed it affects my schedule, although it is nice to sleep in for that hour in the fall. But being a teacher for almost 23 years, I get to see how it affects students' sleep schedules. And usually teenagers are zombie-like in the mornings. Once daylight savings time kicks in, you're like zombies not yet out of the grave. So it's pretty awful.
During the summer, I would say I'm like a late night type of person, so I stay up early. But whenever it gets dark, we switch the clocks back. I'd say I tend to fall asleep pretty early, like 10 or 11.
Honestly, I kind of feel a little out of it, I'm tired, because I can just tell I'm off.
It definitely affects me in the spring because you lose an hour of sleep, so that kind of affects me for a few days afterwards.
Well, there you have it. Back to you in the studio, Stephen.
Thank you, Ben. I'm Stephen Wright of AHS-TV for those of you just joining in. I'm here with Mr. Zablocki and Mr. Landstrom to talk about their opinions on daylight savings time. So, Mr. Zablocki, how do you feel about daylight savings time?
Interestingly enough, I didn't really develop an opinion about daylight savings time. I just function within it. Mr. Landstrom and I had a conversation this summer regarding that, and I think that's what kind of stemmed he and I both being on the show. I'm flexible with it. I could go either way with it. I've accepted it. I'm doing okay with it now as far as waking up and everything. Daylight savings time does not bother me. I see no problem with it. I enjoy watching the sun rise whenever I'm on my way to work. So I'm okay with it.
All right, thank you. Mr. Landstrom?
My position is that I enjoy daylight savings time. Right now, we are in the middle of November. We are in what is called standard time. So daylight saving time has just ended the beginning of November. So my position is we should extend it year round and not have to change the clocks at all and enjoy that extra sunlight and hour of time year round.
I don't hear that opinion often. That's very interesting. Why do you feel this way?
I feel like it's just a nuisance in and of itself to have to change the clocks and then adjust your schedule and your children's schedule and your pet's schedule and carry on with this tradition twice a year.
Oh, but if we're in standard time now, shouldn't it stay like it is? How now? Shouldn't it stay standard?
Well, it would become standard. If we just stayed in it year round, we would be in standard year round. Essentially, you're just moving an hour of sunlight from the morning to the evening when you're in daylight saving. So why not just extend it year round?
I mean, we do it half the year. It wouldn't affect if we did it the whole year. That's a good thought. What are the pros and cons of daylight savings time, Mr. Zablocki?
Well, I know for me, as I'd mentioned this morning, if you saw the sunrise, it was beautiful sunrise driving to work. Otherwise, I would be driving to work in the dark. And I would be at work, in school, in the building, and not be able to see that sunrise. So that's a bonus for me. That's one of the advantages or the pro of daylight savings time. The con is definitely some people have an an adjustment period, and I would say I probably have an adjustment period. It just doesn't affect me as much.
Yeah.
So I think that some people do have a struggle waking up or going to bed later or earlier. Some people have a difficulty waking up. So I think that would be a con. For me, it doesn't bother me too much. I don't know why.
So you're saying if you consider that pro and con, you still don't have an opinion on it?
I honestly, yeah, correct. I do not have a solid opinion on one way or the other.
Interesting.
I could be swayed, possibly.
Maybe by the end of the show,
Possibly
Steve,
by
we
the
can
end of the
change
show,
his mind.
Steve. Yeah.
Hopefully. Do either of you have research to back up your claims?
I've done a little research on my claims here. There's been multiple studies over the years about daylight saving, and they've shown that during the adjustment period, in the spring, when we spring forward, there are higher risks for heart attacks, strokes. They've found that there are harsher judicial sentences given for crimes because the judges are sleep deprived. They've also noticed a spike in traffic accidents, workplace accidents, and when it ends, there's also a larger rate of depression in the fall and winter months, seasonal affective disorder, because we don't have that extra hour of daylight.
Mrs. Zablocki, what do you think about that?
Well, for those reasons, I would certainly not want to wish ill will towards anybody, Stephen. I mean, if those are the kind of things that the results or the effects of changing the daylight savings time, certainly I wouldn't want to see anybody injured or any mental health illnesses affected by it. However, I do know those things happen. Those are definitely results of the daylight savings time. But it's also the lack of only having 10 hours of sunlight a day, whether it be from 6 in the morning till 4 o'clock in the evening or 5 o'clock in the evening to whenever obviously the sun gets higher in the sky in the summer and you have 16 hours or 12 hours of sunlight. Anytime you get more sunlight, I feel that you obviously have more positive energies with you and you're more focused and able to work a little better. But yeah, those are good arguments. Very good.
I agree. Do either of you know why daylight savings time was actually put into place?
Mr. Landstrom informed me of this a couple days ago. We had done some talking prior to this. It was interestingly enough, and as a matter of fact, he does have some really good information regarding that.
Mr. Landstrom, I'll give it to you.
Well, most people believe it was because in World War I they were starting to save energy, okay, which is true. But a lot of people also believe it's for farmers, that they want the extra hour of sunlight. A lot of farmers, though, hate daylight savings because it requires an extra hour essentially in the morning for them to wait for the crops to dry out. But the true reason that daylight savings started was there was a famous Massachusetts retailer named Lincoln Filene. And he figured out if there's more daylight in the day, that once people got off work, they would have more time to shop and spend their money. So he figured out that if you called it, buy more stuff after work time or just more time to go to the store time, nobody's going to go for it. So he and his PR team came up with daylight saving time, and it stuck. So it is considered to be one of the greatest public relations and marketing cons of all time that they got this started. But this was right before World War I, and he didn't really have a chance to keep pushing his agenda. So the U.S. adopted it 2 or 3 years after Germany started it first for the reason of saving energy for the war.
I mean, the original belief that I had was that it was for farmers, so I'm glad that you enlightened me on that. How does daylight savings time affect you personally then? Because you've talked about how it affects in general.
Well, personally, like I said, I just find it to be a nuisance, and it's just adjusting my children's schedule, adjusting my dog's schedule. I just don't see the purpose of it. I'd rather have the extra hour of daylight all year. Why do we have to not have that during the winter months when, once again, if one of the original reasons was to save energy, wouldn't it make more sense to save energy during the dark winter months? That's why we should just extend it year-round.
Makes sense to me. Mr. Zablocki, how does it affect you personally?
It's actually a positive for me. I do a lot of work outside whenever I'm at home. So whenever I'm able to shut things down around 5:30, 6 o'clock, that gives me more time to spend with my family in the house, or we seem to be able to gather together a little earlier. even though the kids, they'll go to bed sometimes earlier because of it. So, and that's part of the adjustment period. Instead of going to bed at 9 o'clock, maybe it's 8:30, 8 o'clock when they're going to bed. So, but for me, it's I'm able to come in a little sooner because I'm not able to be outside. I'm an outside person. I like to just do as much as I can outside. So that's what it does for me. It pushes me inside quicker. So
Good points. Mr. Landstrom, you brought up your kids, like fixing their sleep schedules. So when you were a child, obviously the daylight savings time was still in effect. How did it affect you then? How do you see it affects your kids?
Well, smaller children don't understand the concept of, the clock's ahead 1 hour, I can sleep in an extra hour. They're still getting up at 6 a.m. or 5 a.m., depending, no matter what day it is, if it's daylight saving or not. Same with the dog. The dog's still looking at you to go out same time in the morning, or tapping on the bowl for his food. Like they don't understand. So that's basically how it affects me personally, I would say, the most.
All right. Mr. Zablocki, how did it affect you as kids? Because I know you're a guidance counselor, so I'm sure you see students more often in that way.
Yeah, certainly. I think with the general lack of sunlight for the kids that I see throughout the course of the day, there is a seasonal effectiveness disorder, that kids encounter, and adults. I know adults suffer the same thing, but as a child, again, it forced me into my home sooner, which I was always outside and trying to do things, and Mom was trying to get me back in the house sooner, so that probably helped her out. But as far as being a child, I don't think I have no opinion about it, because whenever I was a kid, it didn't bother me.
It's just always been an effect.
It's just always been an effect. I function within it, and I do see the argument for having another. Would I mind coming in at 6:30 instead of 5:30 in the evening? Yeah, that'd be all right too. But.
Interesting.
One of the other reasons, Stephen, for school-age children is we're putting our elementary kids out and high school waiting for the bus on dark streets right now.
Yes.
If we continued with daylight saving year-round, we'd still have that extra hour of sunlight in the morning. Mr. Lazaroff, who's our physical therapist for the district, can remember in the 1970s when he was walking to elementary school in Ford City, the schools gave out flashlights because back in the 70s there was the energy crisis, and he remembers that there was a law enacted that enacted a law that daylight saving was expanded back a few weeks. So he said it was even darker for a couple more weeks than was previously. So he said the schools gave out flashlights to the kids to walk to school.
It's a good idea. It's interesting.
For safety reasons.
Yeah. You brought up your kids again, and then I asked Mr. Zablocki about student-wise. And earlier you mentioned the crime rates being higher. Do you think that in school-wise, are the grades lower because kids aren't getting enough sleep? Are social issues affected?
Possibly. As Mr. Zablocki said, you enter your house earlier in the evening right now. In essence, you could say you're less productive, which is counterintuitive to the whole point of daylight saving. So for students, though, it gives you extra time to be inside and study and complete your homework. You could argue that aspect of it, but you could also argue that it's, as Mr. Zablocki said, it's safer. It takes the kids off the streets. His mother was always happy that he was inside earlier.
Yes. Mr. Zablocki, what do you think about that?
A lot of some not so good things can happen after dark. So as long as parents know where their kids are and bringing them in at the proper time. And I came in as a kid after dark. I'm not sure that was a couple years ago.
Yeah.
That wasn't just a couple weeks ago. But kids nowadays, I think that they stay out later than normal. I think that kids, there may be a propensity for kids to, when the dark hours come around, and then there's no under the cover of darkness, like kids can get in some little bit more trouble, possibly. So that's a concern. That's a concern for sure. So keeping that extra hour of daylight again may be beneficial. I'm starting to think that Mr. Landstrom's onto something.
Really? So we're beginning to sway you.
Possibly, yeah.
All right. We're going to take a short commercial break, and we'll be right back with more of AHS-TV's Best of the Nest.
I fell in love with the campus, with the people, with my IUP life. for yourself. Visit us. Indiana University of Pennsylvania. Find your success.
And we're back with more of AHS-TV's Best of the Nest. I'm Stephen Wright of AHS-TV, and we're picking back up with Daylight Savings Time. So, before the break, we finished with Mr. Zablocki, you don't fully have an opinion on Daylight Savings Time. Mr. Landstrom, you are for it, but in a different way than some people think. So, Mr. Zablocki, I'll ask you first. How has your opinion changed over the first half of the discussion?
You know, up to this point, it really hasn't. Maybe it's enlightened me on a few things that I didn't know were happening with the daylight savings time going on. Some of the concerns I think Mr. Landstrom raised in regard to the health effects that people have, the sentencing by the judges, that's bothersome. But as far as my opinion, I'm still, I could go either way. Stephen.
Mr. Landstrom, what do you think about Mr. Zablocki's lack of taking an argument?
Well, Mr. Zablocki can be a hard person to persuade sometimes, but he has some valid arguments as well. Hopefully in the second half of the segment here, we might be able to provide some more facts that can help change his mind.
All right, let's see if we can do that. So I'll ask you first. Why do you think it's vital to society? Because you are definitely for it.
Well, it's obviously not vital to society. It's something that was enacted 100 years ago for a reason that was to save energy. And in all essence, today, it's not saving energy at all. I mean, it was a war effort in World War I. When today, during that extra time with sunlight, people are going to the parks, they're going to the mall, you're going shopping, which, as we said before, was one of the reasons it was created as well for commerce. So I don't know. I don't know that it is vital, but I just think the times have changed so much that we need to re-examine it and see if it is vital and if we need to continue this practice and see if some of the health benefits don't outweigh the change.
I'm sure back when it was enacted, those were not thought of.
Probably
the
not.
health benefits. So, Mr. Zablocki, I'll ask you. You don't think it's vital. You don't think it's not vital. You're very open to the argument.
Yeah.
So,
Mm-hmm.
what makes you so open?
That's a great question, Stephen. I think I'm able to just. You're still getting 24 hours in a day, and I think what you do with those 24 hours isn't going to change with whether those 24 hours in the morning. I wake up at 4:30 in the morning. Whether it's daylight savings time and I wake up at 4:30, it's dark. Whether it's not daylight savings time, if it's standard time, 4:30 in the morning is still dark. Yeah. So I think that may have something to do with it. This morning my body was telling me, hey, wake up. I look up, it's 3:30. So I don't think my body's fully adjusted to the daylight savings time yet. We're on standard time. I don't think I've adjusted to that yet. I really don't have a direct connection with. I just feel that there's 24 hours in a day. Make the most of them. And you're only going to get, whether it's daylight savings or standard, you're going to have 10 hours of sunlight. Use them how you will. And that's where in 14 hours of darkness. So you got to figure out how to make the most of them. So
I can't wait. You brought up about how we should re-examine, see if the benefits are the same. So do you think that the benefits are the same? Do you think that they're not the same? What do you think about that?
I believe that we should keep the extra hour during the winter months for more light, for the extra time for exercising. People have less energy. We said you go to bed earlier, you start to settle in earlier because the darkness, it's your internal clock tells you, oh, it's dark out, it's time to settle in, go to bed. Which, like Mr. Zablocki said, is something I do tend to enjoy in the winter months because it gives you that extra time with family and you don't seem as busy and active during winter. But that's not to say if we just had daylight saving all year, maybe I would use that extra hour to be outside more or exercise outside more or go shopping and support the commerce industry. I don't necessarily think we need, I think if we're going to do it, we should keep the extra hour all year long of the sunlight. Why are we robbing it from why are we putting it back in the morning versus the evening?
So, Mr. Zablocki, what do you think of his opinion on keeping it in daylight savings time?
I'm okay with it. I'm okay with keeping it as daylight savings time, how we were functioning prior to switching to the standard time. Again, if I still wake up at 4:30 in the morning, go down to the Richard G. Snyder YMCA in Katanning, and I work out in the morning. It would just give me more of an opportunity to do things with my family in the evening outside till about 6:30 and maybe 7 o'clock. It would get dark, and then inside we would go.
So why do you think it's stayed in effect for so many years? Shouldn't we have been able to look at these benefits or negativities a long time ago and be able to realize?
I think a large reason is because it's confusing. I mean, even sitting here talking with you two, we're struggling to keep our facts straight of whether we're in it, we're out of it, we're in standard. It's confusing. Why, if most of the population doesn't partake in this, why are we doing it? China tried this for 5 years, years back, and they decided it was ridiculous and there was no need, so they did away with it. This is just, like I said, this is just something that seems to benefit stores and other areas more, and that's why we're keeping it. Did you know the biggest lobbyist for daylight savings is the Chamber of Commerce every year? Because they know that extra hour of sunlight is beneficial to small businesses and retailers. They see the need for it to keep that extra hour.
Well, I've heard the argument before of getting rid of daylight savings time, but you think that we should stay in daylight savings time. Why is Commerce not agreeing with that? Why don't they think that extra hour all year round, that would surely help them twice as much?
Well, I think they are lobbying for it. They want to keep it, like they said, because they know in the winter months people aren't as active. Obviously, the holiday season is big enough of a drive for the commerce industry that then they only have 3 months or so till we spring ahead. But they are lobbying to keep daylight saving.
Interesting. So, Mr. Zablocki, I'll ask you. You're almost completely biased to this.
Almost.
How high do you think the percentage is of countries globally that do not use daylight savings time?
I would think 80%, somewhere in that neighborhood.
I would say probably around that as well.
It is about 80% that do not participate in it because they have found that it does not give any benefits. Do you know the percentage of countries that agree with daylight savings time in your opinion, that it should always be daylight savings time versus always standard time?
I do not know that, but I do know there are 2 states in the United States who do not participate at all, and that is Arizona and Hawaii. And I know the main reason in Arizona is because they have the opposite. It's so hot in Arizona that they don't want the extra hour of sunlight in the evening because it's adverse to what we are. People are less productive because it's so hot outside at night. So they would rather get darker earlier to begin to cool down.
So they'd rather stay in standard time.
Correct.
But if you're agreeing with that we should stay in daylight savings time all year round, they surely wouldn't be for that.
Obviously not. But like I said, they have a different reason than what we are saying. I mean, it's a different location of the country. I don't know where I stand on a uniform across the country, but like every state's going to have their own reasoning for which way they feel, which once again goes back to why it probably hasn't been changed since it's been enacted.
Interesting. So, Mr. Zablocki, like I said, you're more biased to this than Mr. Landstrom is. So, do you think there's a way that we can keep doing what we're doing, but also minimize some of the cons that he's brought up?
I think through education. I think through educating people and bringing the light to those people who are affected by it. Yeah, I think that's one way. If we continue to follow the daylight savings time versus standard time, I think just educating people on the whys of how they're feeling, the whys of what they're doing. You know, I think that's you know, the best way.
Yeah, you brought up education, and we talked about it earlier that some people are still confused about how it works.
Yeah,
you know,
yeah,
you know
sure.
which one we're in.
Yeah,
So
being informed.
Yeah,
they need to be
education
informed.
would definitely help. Mr. Landstrom, do you think that there should be a legitimate push to end daylight savings time, or enact it all year round?
Enact it all year round, obviously, as I said, is my position.
Yeah.
There are states, there are 35 states who have just this year in 2019 enacted some sort of, or tried to enact some sort of legislation to deal with it one way or another. Florida passed the Sunshine Protection Act on March 5th, which would require congressional approval. So any of these states are free to legislate on their own, but it still requires national approval before they would be able to enact it. Either the legislation has to be, they have to be exempted from the Federal Uniform Time Act of 1966, or they would have to repeal that act altogether. That legislation was passed in 1966 because one of the stories I read was there was a bus that went from New York to Chicago. And on that bus route, whenever counties they used to be able to just set their own, whether they were in, they were out, whatever they wanted to do. The bus would go through 7 different time zones on its route. And that's why in 1966 they said, enough, everybody has to start doing one thing or another, this is getting too crazy.
So you brought up that elected officials are trying to.
They are trying to get involved and push one way or another, but as I said, the biggest lobbyist for this is the Chamber of Commerce.
Do you think that the people should also try, you know, there are petitions out there that do you think that we should sign them? Do you think that they're going to help to get rid of this issue?
I don't know. So little has been done for so long, which is typical of many issues, but I don't foresee any sort of major change happening anytime soon.
Mr. Zablocki, what do you think about the petition? Would you sign it? Would you sign a petition?
In regard to keeping or doing away with?
Getting rid of it.
In regard, unfortunately, I still have not developed a solid opinion to get rid of daylight savings time. You know, I found it interesting what Mr. Landstrom had said about the different time zones. You know, I do travel as a camper across the United States. I've traveled. I do enjoy traveling west whenever I travel because I gain hours. However, I find coming back home, it's difficult. So I kind of am leaning towards, I guess, getting rid of that.
All right. Well, that's our show for this week. I'd like to thank Mr. Zablocki and Mr. Landstrom for joining me today. Best of the Nest is a production of the students enrolled in television production courses at Armstrong High School. Join us again next week for a look at some of the unique things happening in Armstrong High School and communities. Until then, from our nest to yours, have a great week.